I welcome people. Thank you very much for tuning into another episode of Transfer Khanage. But I am frustrated myself because that outro or intro, I should call it, I wasn't aware of that laugh at the end that he's actually put in there. Ben, honestly, I don't know why he's put that in there, but I think it's something to do with the picture that precedes it, which is of Jude Bellingham, which was apparently nailed on to Liverpool Football Club, and so therefore that laugh is kind of laughing at me, if you know what I mean. But of course, guys, thank you very much for joining us. Sorry we're a little bit late, but as you can see, I have got a esteemed guests, and when you have esteemed guests, you know you have to be patient for the best. I have the wonderful Ben Jacobs from CBS joining me tonight. Thank you so much for making your debut on my channel. I'm so honored.
Absolute pleasure. Great to be here. You did get stitched up with that laugh, though. I definitely agree with that. So next time I come on, different intro.
Unbelievable. But people, exactly, do what Hassan says. Hit the likes on the way. What a show lined up. This is nice. Hi, an Arsenal fan. I like your work and your honest opinions. Keep up the good work from Iran. I love worldwide support, and especially from non-Liverpool fans all the time. That's amazing as well. Big up Grizz, my man Ben Jacobs. Smash the like. Ben's always gets love. I'm not gonna sort of say extra kind words about Ben that I don't need to, and I'm going to be very honest. People, honestly, I've been following Ben for not long, which is embarrassing for me, but since I have been, any sort of story that I want a full explanation, concise, precise, and to the best of his knowledge, some of his threads are sensational. If you're not following Ben Jacobs, you should do so. He's a man of great knowledge, great insight, and he actually makes you understand. He speaks very clearly and concisely, and it's been a pleasure to follow. But enough of that, Ben. We haven't got the time because I know you're very busy, and we have got a jam-packed show. We must start off with, just in case you guys didn't know, smash the like button before we go any further. Hit the like button if you haven't, subscribe if you haven't. Ben, I'm going to start off with it's a Liverpool Football Club show, and I'm going to start off with I could have started off with Leicester City because both of our clubs have disappointed us this season. I'm so sorry to bring that up. Just when you thought season's ended, I can stop worrying about Leicester. It is what it is. I'm sorry to bring it back up, but both of our clubs disappointed us this season.
They did, unfortunately. And from Leicester's point of view, it was a strange season full of highs and then lows and then a lack of goal scoring and then lots of goals scoring, but too many shipped. And there was never that consistency. And when I look at the early part of the season, I think Leicester felt like they would be restricted because they hadn't been able to move in the summer due to the financial situation at the club. And the perversity of that is that the infrastructure of Leicester very strong, and they've built a brand new training centre called Seagrave. And in addition to that, there'll be a stadium redevelopment too. So the bones of the club are strong, but due to financial fair play, due to all the success and the high wages and the bonuses that they've had to pay out, suddenly they got in a position where the spending needed to stop. And that definitely impacted Leicester over the course of the summer. They lost Wesley Fofana to Chelsea as well. Didn't start the season particularly well, but it really picked up just before the World Cup break, and they went on a run, and James Maddison had a phenomenal first half of the season. And then again, shortly after the World Cup, after a lull in terms of their opening few results, they got another couple of big results. I remember them winning and thrashing Aston Villa and then following that up by beating Spurs and coming from behind. And again, you thought, okay, they've taken a step forwards, but it was always one step forwards, two steps back. And then they got down the stretch, and I think it suddenly hit the football club. Hang on a minute. We actually are in a genuine relegation fight. We're not too good to go down. And then from there, I think they made a mistake in getting rid of Brendan Rodgers. And I don't mean that the former Liverpool boss shouldn't have been sacked. What I mean is for 18 months, it was apparent that it wasn't working between Rodgers and Leicester. So he should have gone earlier, and then that would have given the club the opportunity to get in a permanent successor long before they were dragged into the mire. Or you realise that you're heading towards trouble and you keep Rodgers until the end of the season. So I had no real issue with Rodgers going, but I think the timing of his departure was wrong and detrimental. And then Dean Smith came in, and really had that same task like Big Sam at Leeds, where it was going to be a bit of a lottery. And unfortunately for Leicester, they went to Newcastle last minute in that game. They had their one chance after being defensively resolute. Timothy Castagna couldn't quite score. He hit the shot well, but it was brilliantly saved by Nick Pope. And if Leicester win that game, then they would have stayed up, because then fate would have been in their hands. They beat West Ham, and it would have been Everton that went down. So it's fine margins, but it's also a 38-game season. So Leicester can have no excuses. They've kind of complacently sauntered towards relegation. It hit them too late. They reacted in the wrong ways from a football perspective. And as good a club as they are, and as well run as they have been over the last few years, they now have to bounce back. And if they don't come up straight away, then you're suddenly stuck in a highly competitive championship with no guarantees that you're ever going to return to the Premier League anytime soon. So next season is vital, and it'll be very interesting to see how many players Leicester are able to hang on to.
Absolutely. That kind of segues into sort of speaking about Liverpool, listening to some of the points that you was making, especially in terms of structure and how they operate, investment needed, bouncing back after disappointing seasons. You could almost relate that to Liverpool Football Club. We know on the back of such a close call with footballing immortality last season, Liverpool Football Club suddenly had a dramatic downfall this season. It's fair to say. I think most Liverpool fans would possibly call it a disaster. Maybe some would say very, very disappointing at the very least, especially in the context of what happened last season, what we found. And some of the interesting points to note I wanted to speak to you about was sort of the structure. And we know FSG, along with Michael Edwards, previously Julian Ward, Jurgen Klopp, and the team of people, the great people that work around him, had a specific way of working and a specific way that enabled us to reach the top without sort of spending the many billions other clubs have spent. There seems to be a slight shift to the common fan. But has there been a slight shift, or is it just a changing of the guard, but the structure and the philosophy stays the same? I wanted to get your opinions on that to start off with.
Well, I think with Liverpool, they always have a plan. And I appreciate that fans listening won't see too much evidence of that, particularly on the football side with the midfield, because they'll believe that the plan was Bellingham and perhaps even previously Tchouaméni. And in both instances, because the club didn't get that target, and in Bellingham's case, pulled out, the fan base will ultimately say, if there's a plan, how did they allow for the midfield to become in a position that was not only detrimental to qualifying for Champions League football, but the long-term identity of the football team? Because it's obvious, not just in the midfield, but particularly, I think, in the centre of the park, that there's players that have been top class for Liverpool that are the wrong side of their peak. So there has to be a succession plan. And then when you get a few injuries, as unfortunately Liverpool had, you suddenly start to realise that they are thin in certain departments. And as a consequence, it's been a really disappointing season, because Liverpool have never really got going with the same consistency as in seasons gone by. And unfortunately for Liverpool, Newcastle have come up from a team that were fighting relegation the season before the one that's just finished to qualifying for the Champions League. Manchester United have improved. Arsenal have improved. So Liverpool have undoubtedly taken a series of steps backwards. But behind the scenes, there is still calmness and a belief that a rebuild will take time, but they've got the right people in place to do it. So Jorga's come in, that's now been announced. It's a short-term deal, which might alarm some Liverpool fans, because they'll be saying, if it's only 3 months, does that not mean that they don't know who they want in the long term? But Liverpool have always been about transitions, and I think that it's fair to term this one of them. And the beauty is Liverpool can have their cake and eat it, because they've got somebody out of retirement, which is the logic of the slightly shorter term deal.
So is that official? He was in official retirement. Can we clarify that?
Well, I think that he had said when he'd left Wolfsburg earlier in 2023 that his plan was retirement. Now, when you take a job and you're still under the age of 60, you may decide that you have a challenge that wants to keep you within this type of day-to-day, all-consuming football role. So I think that's for him to say, whether he was literally in his slippers with a jacket on by a fireplace, smoking a cigar with a beer in hand and thinking, thank God I'm out of the game, or whether it was more a sabbatical with a view to either taking an opportunity if it arose or being quite happy retiring and going off into the sunset. And I'm sure over the course of the coming weeks and months, and also at the end of the summer window, we'll find out the true reality there. But contractually, there is an opportunity to extend. So Liverpool almost get a try before they buy scenario. And from Jorg's point of view, he can pick up something he's very familiar with, which is managing a window. And then if at the end of it, they go their separate ways, or Liverpool use that time to recruit somebody who's ready to come in for the January window, they can do that as well. So transition is a really key word, and it might frustrate fans, and also one or two maybe pointing to other names and saying, wouldn't they be better? Wouldn't they be more long-term? But remember, this is a Liverpool recruitment team that do things by numbers. So this isn't about Jorg coming in and rocking the boat and changing things. This is really about him buying into the club culture and structure, and yes, leading it and resolving certain things and going straight into the firing line, as far as trying to get, for example, Alexis McAllister over the line, and also deal with any outgoings that are still needed as well. But other people at the club, Barry Hunter, for example, the chief scout, not only remain vitally important, but they've been doing the planning. So this won't see a massive amount of change or upheaval in terms of targets, in terms of structure, in terms of strategy. He's there, and he's come in the short term because Liverpool are absolutely convinced that he can seamlessly take over the role without it causing any problems, without it preventing any early business from not happening in the window, and whether he stays or goes, still allowing the club to move on and plan for January. And when FSG announced that they were considering some form of investment, the whole of the recruitment team were informed of the plan, and they knew what the budgets would be in each window, and they were well aware of what the long-term roadmap was for the club and all the different permutations that could potentially happen. And when, for example, Dr. Ian Graham left and people questioned what's going on, all of these senior outgoings at Liverpool, big change potentially to the data department, Liverpool said for months and months and months, and I think we were on another show and we discussed it at the time, that there was a plan, that there was a transition, that there was somebody in mind. And we now know that that person is Will Spearman, an internal promotion. So I totally appreciate that when fans hear everything, all they're going to say is we missed out on Champions League football. We've got an aging squad. We're past our peak. There's no consistency. There's a lack of depth. And there's a real danger that if we don't do something soon this summer, we'll stay out of the top four and be in big, big trouble because other clubs are moving in more positive directions. And I get that. And I certainly empathize with how that looks on the football side. But I think that behind the scenes at Liverpool, they're sticking to their model. They're sticking to their structure. And because it's generated so much success in the past, I personally feel like it will come to fruition again, that over the course of the summer months, they'll be able to do enough in the market to get Liverpool back to where they belong, which is obviously a near automatic qualifier for the Champions League.
That could be music to a lot of Liverpool fans' ears, or that could be, what's the opposite of music?
Could be triggering.
Yeah, it could be triggering a few Liverpool fans, and especially how you spoke about sort of you expect the structure, and from what the people that you speak to in and around Liverpool, the structure will remain the same. It's nothing to worry about. There's been personnel change, but the actual structure and the framework will be the same in terms of sort of how they operate. And you mentioned data and numbers. The incoming head of research, isn't it? Sort of Will Spearman is, by all accounts, a genius in his field, it is said. So therefore, that will remain the same. What do you know about George? I'm going to call him George. I'm going to struggle to say his surname. If someone wants to correct me and tell me the exact sort of pronunciation, I don't want to butcher it. I'm going to call him George, affectionately known as George. Is George a data man? Is he an analytics man? Will he continue the sort of the line of analysis, play analysis based on numbers and data, like, for example, Michael Edwards most certainly did, and Julian Ward, who was his protege?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, he'll be working with Ward before the transfer window opens. So there's effectively a 2 or 3 week handover. And even though the announcement was today, he's already met the senior leadership and has that personal relationship with Jurgen Klopp as well. So there's no concerns about a fit in terms of either strategically or in a personality sense. He's very no nonsense as well. That's the other thing to say.
He looks it, if there's such a thing of looking no nonsense, if you know what I mean.
So I don't think that we're going to see any real games, and Liverpool have been quite notorious in the past for giving players a consistent narrative, whether they sign them or not, and trying not to get sucked into the nonsense that surrounds the window, anything to agent fuel, anything potentially misleading around prices or around process. Now, it's the transfer window. It's nuts. It's crazy. There's always elements of that. And part of winning in a race for a particular player is about playing some of those games. But you get somebody that's very no nonsense and is not afraid to get his hands dirty. And Barry Hunter is exactly the same, by the way. So just to give you an example of that with Hunter, but Jurg will be exactly the same as well. What Liverpool do differently to other clubs is they go to families of players and even fans of the team that they're currently at in what I would term a slightly unorthodox way, because they want to get right to the heart of all of the different aspects of a possible signing before making a decision. Whereas what you find with other clubs is they're up there in the stand when they're scouting. They're obviously inputting all the data, which Liverpool do as well. But Barry, as I understand it, will go in the away end at a football ground and he'll put on a beanie hat and he won't necessarily be too recognizable. And why will he sit there? Because who are the most fervent fans? Who are the ones that really know about a player? Who are the ones that might shout positive or negative things towards a player? It's, of course, the fans that go up and down the country. So you get a unique perspective there. And maybe it gives you an opportunity to go a bit more under the radar. And maybe it gives you a chance to meet with the family who might be in that section, potentially in some cases, of the stadium. And it's that commitment to going to an unfashionable ground on an away day, miles away, with the hardcore fans, even though they may not realize that you're sitting right behind them. And it's not only one individual. So I certainly don't want to paint it as Liverpool's high-tech, data-driven, extremely intelligent, strategic, collaborative team are basically just buying away tickets. So don't confuse the point that I'm making. But what I'm saying is it's one thing they may do sometimes to get another perspective. And Jurg, I'm told, is exactly the same, that he really wants to dig beneath the surface of players that he signs. So it's not just about what does the data show, which is one aspect, and that's the scientific part. And it's not just about the gut instinct, and it's not just about how those two marry and feed up to the senior decision makers. It's also about how the individuals who are the senior decision makers actually integrate themselves in the process before Liverpool choose to move. And sometimes you need an unorthodox tactic. Sometimes you try something a bit more unique or old school or novel. And Jurg buys into that philosophy from what I'm told. And he's been given the title of sporting director because that's his bag ultimately. He spent the last 4+ years before he left Wolfsburg in early 2023 in that role. And I think that that's significant because originally there was a feeling that he might be called a transfer consultant. And as soon as you say transfer consultant, it has that interim feel. It has that distance perhaps from the senior leadership because it paints a picture of somebody coming in, somebody only being short term. Whereas the fact that they've trusted him with that title of sporting director, it tells you that they are prepared to surrender control to him in order to run the team collaboratively. And I think that in this context, the most important thing is not who's the most forthright, who's the best negotiator. It's actually freedom to challenge. And it's a very underrated quality within a transfer committee style model. And Chelsea obviously need to develop this as well with their own one. If you have all of these cooks, if you like, for want of a better phrase, and they are either all yes men and women feeding up to the top, or they just don't get along and there's friction and there's egos, then it's never going to work. And what Liverpool have always done really well, regardless of title, is had a senior leadership team with a genuine appetite for debate and a freedom to challenge, which is why with any signing, you would expect some form of healthy disagreement or debate, eventually leading to a unity, and then everyone's able to move in the same direction. And Liverpool have always got that balance really well. And I think that Mike Gordon's been very important in all of this as well, because it wasn't only something for Klopp, and because Klopp had that relationship, it was very much about FSG ensuring that somebody is going to be able to come in and improve them. And he'll improve them because of a few things. His work ethic is notorious. There is that heaviness in terms of desire to use data. And I think that will be very significant as well, because that is ultimately Liverpool's model. But he's one of these individuals that is also prepared to kind of evolve and adapt from what I'm told. And by that, I mean that he's not only going to rely on data, or only going to rely on what he's inherited, or only going to rely on a gut instinct. It's a mixture of everything. There's an understanding of what he can bring, which to an extent is that forthrightness in negotiations and that eye for talent spotting. But he's also going to be surrounded with all of these pre-existing resources. And I think that he'll be perfect in the short term to kind of balance the data side, which he has and will continue to lean heavily on, with that kind of gut instinct and confidence in his own decision making. And that's probably the last thing I'd say on him, that everyone I speak to refers to the fact that he has this confidence in decision making. You'll get an honest upfront answer and a quick one. And when he determines whatever decision he believes is right, he sticks to it. There's no real self-doubting. There's no worry. There's no panic if the market changes or if another target becomes available. There's no sort of U-turn. And that confidence is what Liverpool are going to need to obviously get effective business done, and early.
Manas of Sony Sports Network says, loving every second of this. I'm actually loving it more than you guys so far. I'm just sat here listening, and it's been educational. But all we ask for is a like. So if you are loving it, there's nearly 700 of you guys in here. Smash the like button for us. Subscribe if you haven't. Make sure you go and follow Ben Jacobs on Twitter, on all these social media platforms, I should say, for more pearls of wisdom. We're not going to, as you said, I'm not going to ask you much more on him. But it was crucial because a lot of people wanted to sort of speak about the relationship that he's had with, I remember you, as George, you said it much better than me, but I'm going to stick to George. And obviously his relationship with Michael Edwards was on the outside wonderful and brilliant. And then there was some suspicion or some rumors circulating that the short span of Julian Ward didn't go as smoothly. Maybe, again, just rumors of Jurgen Klopp wanting more of an active role in terms of pursuing or going after targets that he wanted. Today, George, in his first but sort of in his first interview, has said that nothing will change. Jurgen Klopp suggests the type of player he needs, maybe players, and then we, part of the data team and the recruitment team, go out and look for them. That suggests to me, on the outside, that won't change. But there does seem to be a slight shift in power, because I'm going to call a spade, Ben. George wouldn't be recruited if Jurgen Klopp wasn't the manager of Liverpool. I think that's fair to say. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that Jurgen Klopp has had a lot of say in this appointment, but I also think that he can have say because it's only short term.
Sure.
So if you give the manager the ability to be part of the interview process along with other senior figures, then first of all, you get an aim that is deemed to be right for everybody on the senior leadership team at the club. And second of all, if it works, you can extend him. And if it doesn't work, you can continue recruitment for some kind of other name. And I think it was obvious that Liverpool were going to move in this direction. I know that we heard some rumours of Paul Mitchell or somebody else coming in for the long term at Liverpool, but I was always told quite categorically that Mitchell was seen by Liverpool as almost caught between two roles of seniority. So perhaps too experienced for a technical director type position and not quite experienced enough to come in as a lead sporting director at a club like Liverpool, in their opinion. Maybe not far off, and things can change over time. And Chelsea looked at Mitchell as well. But I do think it's telling that for all of the Mitchell rumours or bandwagon, he hasn't gone to Liverpool. He hasn't gone to Manchester United yet. He hasn't gone to Chelsea, even though consistently we've heard the same links. And one of the reasons for that, speaking to industry insiders over the last year, is because he's still learning, he's still climbing, he's still relatively young. And I do think that Manchester United is a possibility for him, but Liverpool were never in a position where they could have got in Paul Mitchell or wanted to get in Paul Mitchell. They had other priorities and names in mind. And that again is because Liverpool want someone that's going to continue their model. The whole point of having this type of model is, in theory, it becomes quite foolproof despite the fact that you have changes. And this is going to be the big test now, because it's gone from Michael Edwards to Julian Ward, now a temporary sporting director. Ian Graham has gone. So there has been a lot of upheaval behind the scenes. So this is going to be the real test. And I'm not going to come on here, especially not out of respect to Liverpool fans that follow the club week in, week out, and start predicting exactly what is going to happen in terms of the model or the individuals. But what I would say is that let's circle back at the end of the summer, because if Liverpool do what they always do, which is astute signings that improve the squad, midfield revamp, a few savvy outgoings, and then on top of that start the season strongly, then if everyone's happy with the window, they'll be happy with the model. And if they're happy with the model, with a range of different people in that model, then it's obvious that the model doesn't change. And the people I speak to at Liverpool say this transfer committee, or whatever you want to call it, hasn't really altered since when Brendan Rodgers was there. It's exactly the same mentality. It's exactly the same type of structure. It's exactly the same type of balance between that data and that gut instinct. And it's got exactly the same element of filtering up. And it's very interesting how it works, because if you're at the top of the pyramid and you ask me a question about Klopp and power, you're not necessarily making the decision from the top down. It's very much a bottom-up system. So those that are higher up in the hierarchy get things fed up to them. And then at some point, those within the senior hierarchy have to determine how much information they're going to give to somebody like Jurgen Klopp within his decision-making. And by that, I mean, if we go to the bottom of the pyramid, Liverpool will happily employ somebody that only knows maths and doesn't even know the targets they're looking at. And they'll just ask them to come up with a load of algorithms. And even internally, they might come up with a load of crazy maths-based algorithms looking at things for marginal gain, which might sound ridiculous to you and me. Like, take your current squad and who performs better on a Wednesday night compared to a Tuesday night? Who performs better when the temperature drops below 5 degrees, below 0 degrees? Who's better with a yellow ball compared to a white ball? Why not? You can do every algorithm under the sun. But quite clearly, it would be farcical to then feed all of that up to Jurgen Klopp and say, make a decision based on your team selection or who you want in the transfer market. But that's how they might start on the data side, by just running numbers with no real football knowledge, because it's a perspective. And there'll be somebody else at a lower level with purely football knowledge and gut instinct. Then there'll be a range of people with a bit of everything. And once they've compiled all of their information and logged it, that's when it starts to get digested, because the information is effectively going to create paralysis by analysis unless you do something with it. So it's quite academic. And then once you've worked out what's relevant and what's not relevant, so effectively you filtered it, it goes up a level. And the senior leadership obviously are across everything, and they're working with people at all levels. And finally, once you've got something, whether it's relating to a transfer or whether it's relating to something within your squad that is relevant, that's when it will start to filter up and potentially be shown to somebody more senior. And the committee eventually will make their decision. So this isn't really about Klopp saying, I want power, I want to demand who I'm signing. This is about Klopp being part of a collaborative process. And the fact that he likes the people he works with and knows them well means that he's able to navigate that dynamic effectively and have his say, of course. And when you're dealing with a really elite player, there will just be times where, forget what the data says, Klopp just knows because he's a football expert and he sees an elite level player all the time and he wants them. There'll be other times where maybe the player's 19 years of age and less familiar in the market. And then maybe other people at the club will have to give a bit more of a steer and a brief. But there's a science aspect, there's a gut instinct aspect, there's a middle ground between the two, and there's a structure. So this isn't about Klopp from the top saying, I want more power, I'm going to bring in my mate, we're going to decide who we want to sign, and then we're going to instruct the experts at the club to go out and get them. This is still about Liverpool's model being Liverpool's model, which is collaborative, which is data-driven, and to be honest with you, involves a bunch of unsung heroes.
I'm glad you've explained sort of how nuanced it is, as opposed to, like you sort of said near the end, where Jurgen Klopp hires his best mate and says, I want X, Y, Z, go and sort it out. It's far more complex than that. Liverpool haven't reached the heights and levels they've reached. If it was as simplistic and sort of based on something like that, just emotion, it's far more nuanced, it's far more technical. And what you're telling us suggests that the formula is still in place, just the personnel have been tweaked with, and that happens. Of course, it's over a span of sort of 6-7 years. You could say that the same team has been in place, and it's inevitable. And it's also inevitable moving on, Ben, because it's also inevitable the playing personnel changes. And of course, we've addressed or spoken about the issues and problems, especially in the midfield area. George has quite an opening window for himself. Some call it probably the most important window in Liverpool's FSG history, Jurgen Klopp's history, Jurgen Klopp's tenure. We know Jurgen Klopp has created magnificent teams from scratch, but hasn't evolved a winning team. This is his first rebuild at Mainz, at Dortmund. He built great teams, but never managed to rebuild them. He left before he rebuilt them. According to the people that you speak to, there's absolutely full faith in Jurgen Klopp. And I think because there is an element of nervousness, doubt, apprehension, because he hasn't, as great a manager as he is, Ben, he hasn't actually rebuilt the team that he built, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that as we look ahead to the summer, it's going to be about priority positions, which is why Liverpool sources had said regarding Jude Bellingham, they preferred to, in the end, put that budget on a series of players rather than gamble on one and a long drawn-out saga that still they might have lost to Real Madrid, because as I've said many times earlier, not now because Liverpool have pulled out, it was a case of Liverpool and Real doing the legwork and Liverpool being confident on the player side, but not necessarily on the fee, because there's no release clause in Bellingham's current deal at Dortmund. So always a possibility, therefore, that with no yardstick, which a release clause, if set at a reasonable number, can sometimes provide, Dortmund are just going to hold out for the biggest possible number. And there's a kind of paradox here, because before we maybe come on to some other names, people will now look at Bellingham and say, Real Madrid have got a clear run, it seems, and the number appears either lower or what people expected from Bellingham. And if they somehow can get the player for around about 100 million euros, which was always Real's intent, not to get him to sign a new deal, try and get him for under 100 million quid, and 100 million euros ticks those boxes. There'll be bonuses and add-ons and so on, but it's probably 20 to 25 million lower than some of the numbers that the Liverpool side were quoting when they pulled out, albeit it has to be said that Liverpool were also talking about agent fees on top, talking about the wages, and we should respect that because these are big numbers as well. But I can understand that Liverpool fans listening with Bellingham will just say, wait a minute, it's exactly the same number as you knew it would always be. So why pull out only to find that Real get him for the number that we always thought he would end up being sold for? And the paradox here is, of course, if Liverpool returned or Manchester City returned, then Dortmund get a bidding war and the number goes up. So Real have somehow pulled off a blinder here, because they've not only persuaded the player, which was always one strong possibility, but in addition to that, because of Liverpool pulling out and Manchester City seemingly at this point not trying to hijack the deal, Dortmund can't create a bidding war to bump the price up even more. And I think 6 months ago, the Dortmund feeling was that they would get more than one credible offer. And as a consequence, the number might be even higher. But if Liverpool take that, let's just call it Bellingham-like budget, and let's also just say that's 130 million because we're talking about fee plus wages plus agents' fees, then what can they get with that and quickly during the course of the window? And that's where you start looking at somebody like Alexis Mac Allister, who...
Well, this is it. Perfectly segues into sort of the first name we can, and of course the chat will inundate us with questions and players and sort of throw us names that we would like to speak on. But you've set it up brilliantly. You can tell you're a master at this. You've segued into sort of talking about Jude, the price. It makes financial sense from a financial point of view, and the amount of work Liverpool needed to do. I don't think Liverpool envisaged doing this much work maybe a season or maybe about 12 to 18 months ago when they would have started doing the legwork on Jude. But now it's come to a point where it's very apparent that not only do they need a rebuild in midfield, but possibly a centre-back or two as well. So therefore, it makes sense, as hard as it is for Liverpool fans up and down the country and all around the world to accept why they've pulled out of Jude Bellingham. I think it makes sense from a financial point of view in terms of how much depth of work is needed now. And so that goes into sort of what can we get for that money? Can we get 2 or 3 players for the 130 million circa? And the first name that I want to discuss with you is Alexis Mac Allister of Brighton and Hove Albion. I know me and you have discussed our interest in Moises Caicedo in the past, but it seems like until you tell us otherwise, unless you tell us otherwise, it seems like the player that we're closest to acquiring from Brighton and Hove Albion is Alexis Mac Allister.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that Liverpool want to move fast to make sure that there's no possibility of a hijack from a rival. It's obvious that Mauricio Pochettino likes the player, and in addition to that, wants proven Premier League quality. But Chelsea are pushing at the moment for Manuel Ugarte at Sporting, and that might allow Liverpool a clearer path for Alexis.
That answers that quickly. So I'm so sorry. That quickly answers this super chat. What's the feeling on Ugarte? The feeling on Ugarte is probably Chelsea, definitely not Liverpool. Sorry, Ben.
PSG or Chelsea for Ugarte. Don't rule out Newcastle either, but they'll also have to move fast because that's advancing, and it's advancing because, a bit like I was saying before, there's a release clause number. So as soon as you have a release clause that is seen to be market value, it can be like Enzo Fernandez's, which was sky high. Chelsea still paid something around it anyway, but with a different structure. But if the release clause is more market value orientated, it sets a yardstick. And then often clubs, if they think that there's good value in that number, will just look for a different payment structure because they don't want to trigger it and have to pay the release clause in one lump sum, which is usually the case with a release clause. So Ugarte to Chelsea or PSG is a real possibility. And I'm told that the player is very tempted by the Premier League. And Ugarte to Liverpool was never really a thing. And I think that's important to stress. Liverpool have not lost out on Ugarte. They were never really seriously in any kind of race for him. It's as simple as that. And if they wanted to be, because of the fact that Ruben Amorim and Sporting know that the player will leave and go somewhere, they're not going to be able to hang on to him. They could have got that one done relatively quickly as well, as we're going to find that either Chelsea or PSG are likely to do so. With Alexis Mac Allister, Liverpool are hoping that there's nobody else that complicates this situation, that there's no surprises, if you like. And they've been tracking him for quite some time, even before the World Cup. And Brighton played the situation very smartly because they extended the contract of Alexis Mac Allister before he went off to the World Cup. And they did that to settle the player, but also on the understanding that come the summer, he would still be allowed to leave if he wanted to. And there's no release clause that just allows someone to trigger a set amount, but there is a form of exit clause within the contract, which is complicated because it keeps Brighton with the upper hand as far as the financials are concerned, but it allows clubs to talk to Alexis Mac Allister and get a deal done. And if the right package is presented to the player, then Brighton will engage. They're not going to stand in his way. So it's ultimately going to come down in likelihood just to fee. and then whether anybody else enters the race late and tries and complicates the situation. But Liverpool are confident. They know the player is interested by not only the project, but working with Jurgen Klopp. They are aware that Champions League football, or the lack of it in Liverpool's case, is not a problem over the course of one season. Of course, McAllister wants to play Champions League season after season, but he's fully convinced, as was Jude Bellingham, by the way, that if it isn't there into this season, and we now know it isn't, but I phrase it that way because when they were talking to Bellingham, it still was unclear. Not a problem, because again, there's a belief in the project, there's a belief in the culture, there's a belief in the teammates, there's a belief in the manager. It's exactly the same with Alexis McAllister as well. So I would expect McAllister, and this is pessimistic, by the way, but it just depends on clubs and timing. Sometimes things are kept more secret. Sometimes things are announced early. Sometimes things are delayed until the window opens. But I think by the time we get to June the 14th, and that is a pessimistic estimation, McAllister's future will be fully resolved somewhere. And at the moment, that's looking very likely to be Liverpool. So anybody else basically has got effectively 2 weeks, if they want to jump in and try and complicate the situation, because by the 14th of June, and very possibly before, but it just depends when we get any announcement, that will be a done deal. McAllister's been clear all along that he wants it resolved right at the beginning of the window. He wants to have his holiday and know what club he is returning to when they come back to pre-season. So I think that if this comes off, and it's looking extremely positive and advanced at this point, it will be an example once again of Liverpool doing their business smartly and early.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, the way you've explained it and broken it down in terms of the contract, the clause or type of clause that suggests that the player can be spoken to, and it's very obvious and apparent from very reliable outlets in Argentina as well, that the player's entourage, his father, who's very active, have been speaking to Liverpool, and Liverpool have done that word again. And I know a lot of Liverpool fans don't like that word that we use, the legwork, the groundwork, because obviously we've done similar with Jude Bellingham, but it seems as though we've done a lot of groundwork and legwork in this situation with this said player, and therefore it would take a huge turnaround, in not only in terms of the talks that they've had with the player, but in terms of anyone else sort of, as you said, sabotaging the deal or hijacking the deal. But it's a funny old game, as we know, and things, until they are absolutely signed, sealed, and delivered, things can happen. But from what you understand, and from what I understand as well, that it's very close. It's very close to be completed, and especially the time frame that's involved now. I think that's very important. Very briefly, because I don't think it's worth spending too long on, because of the nature of the situation we find ourselves in with McAllister, Moises Caicedo. We had interest, and obviously we weren't able to sort of further that interest. Do you see Moises Caicedo leaving? I think that's very important, but it's not going to be Liverpool, is it?
No, I don't think so. So Caicedo is an interesting one. We had lots of links in January. I got hammered throughout January for repeatedly saying that Liverpool were not in the race, that Liverpool were not going to sign him, and that Liverpool hadn't bid, even though I'm aware that there were reports that said Liverpool had placed not one but two offers. But we can only report our sources, and I still believe that Liverpool didn't do anything for Caicedo in January. Chelsea made an opening bid of around about £55 million, and then they realised that Brighton were not going to sell. Arsenal took over. He got his new agent in. Very aggressive tactic of essentially saying he wanted to leave the club towards the end of the window, but Brighton weren't budging. Like with McAllister, they handled it well. They subsequently offered him a new contract, which he signed on the understanding that he will also be allowed to leave this summer for the right offer. And that's Brighton all over. Sensible, a smart model. They keep negotiations in their hands. They bring in replacements before they let players go. They wouldn't sell to Arsenal at 70 million. And now this summer, a number of the same suitors will be back. So Arsenal could be one. Declan Rice is their priority. We have to wait and see whether Rice and Caicedo would be possible both in terms of the dynamic, because both players will want to play week in, week out, and Arsenal have got other midfielders. But it is interesting that Granit Xhaka looks like going to Bayer Leverkusen, so there will be some midfield space freed up. Chelsea, I think, are ones to watch with Moises Caicedo. And then with Liverpool, I'll just reiterate what I've said before, which is they had a historical interest in him before he joined Brighton when he was at IDV. And they didn't move, even though Brighton ended up paying a very small fee for the player, because the agent situation was complicated. And like with Bellingham, it's not only about the number that you pay, it's also about all the side fees. And Liverpool didn't see value in that type of deal. And generally, it's not what they do. They don't go off and pay multiple agencies representing the player, multiple fees. They don't deal with side things around image rights or lots of different sell-on fee clauses. They want clean deals, regardless of whether the deal is £1 or £100 million. They stick again to this structure of making sure that their transactions are clean. But there was an interest in Caicedo before he joined Brighton. And since then, they've just not seen any value. And now, if you take the 70 million that Arsenal were offering, which was an all-in price, including add-ons, and if you look at the fact that he signed a new contract to protect his value, it's going to be very difficult to get Caicedo, I think, only my opinion, cheaper than Alexis McAllister. Alexis McAllister was being valued in January before, I suppose, more suitors came in, and certainly before the World Cup. So if we go a little bit further back to kind of October, November, more like 25 to 30 million, which might sound ridiculous because now clearly he's double that, and Brighton are definitely going to take double that. Even a optimistic bargain number for McAllister would be 50 million. And I wouldn't even put that number out there because I think it's going to be more than that. But let's wait and see, because it's not just about number, it's about structure as well. And this is something that people forget during a transfer window. But regardless of that, the McAllister valuation was a lot lower by multiple clubs looking at him than the one for Caicedo. And I think that because Caicedo now has a higher price tag in likelihood, it's very likely that Liverpool won't see any value in that. Whereas maybe with McAllister, Chelsea, for example, thought 25 to 30. If Liverpool are seeing the progression, if they're seeing the inflated market, if they're seeing other players available at that 45, 50, 55, 60 mark, maybe they're thinking, okay, given the season he's had, given the World Cup he's had, given other players that like him at certain prices, and given the fact that there's an urgency and a need and a desire, and you've still got a young player with an excellent profile, it's worth it on every front. But with Caicedo, if you're saying come back in and pay 60, 70, 80, 90 million, because that's what Brighton may demand, I just don't think that Liverpool will consider that when they didn't consider it in the first place back in January. And everyone sort of says with Caicedo that he was never for sale. And that's definitely true in the last week of the window and under the new agent. And from Liverpool's perspective, they saw him as probably not for sale earlier in the window because it was unclear who was representing him. And that was problematic as well. But I think that if Arsenal had, regardless of the complications, just put down 70 million on January the 1st, not the end of January, it would have been more difficult for Brighton, because then there's a whole month where the player's basically driving an exit and wanting to move, and eventually something might have had to give. So Arsenal kind of ran out of time, but this is the difference once again, that Arsenal were scrambling at the end of a window and Liverpool were turning around with Caicedo and saying, look, we know it's complicated. We know the agent situation is difficult. We know the number they're asking for is high. We know that the longer it goes on, the more they're just not going to sell. So nothing added up to really allow Liverpool to succeed in January. And because, as I say, he's now signed a new deal and the valuation of Caicedo is probably still going to be high, I would personally be surprised, unless they miss out on a ton of other targets and U-turn on their position, if Liverpool enter the race for Moises Caicedo. But we'll have to wait and see, because first of all, you've got to get your targets early and then see how they gel in. Then you have pre-season, and you don't want to sign too many too early. You want to sign who you need early and is available in the market. get back into pre-season and look at the chemistry, maybe even go into the early part of the season to work out what you need, and then you move again definitively to make sure that you fill any holes once you've looked at the chemistry, once you've looked at the squad that you've got. And it's a long window, and it's much more of a buyer's market comparative to January. But right now, as of the time we're recording this, there's nothing significant between Liverpool and Moises Caicedo.
There may not be Moises Caicedo on the agenda, but there's certainly more than one midfielder on the agenda. And what I found interesting this window, or the lead up to this window, is we've discussed how Liverpool operate very secretly, almost, and swiftly when they want to target. In most cases, and in recent history, there seems to be a lot of names bandied about. Ben, is there a reason for so many names to be bandied about, and quite publicly? So when we speak about being bandied about, I don't mean sort of folks on Twitter just making up random names, but we're talking about reliable journalists who have links to the club, having almost a list of suggestions or players that they suggest are linked with Liverpool. And a lot of them are being sort of coming to the fore now. People, there's nearly 900 of you nears. Let's get to 400 likes very, very quickly before we start getting your questions in. I'm not going to be able to, if everyone asks a question, I'm not going to be able to ask 900 questions, but most certainly we'll be able to ask a fair few. This is a very simple one. We can quickly move on. Agam sends in a super chat, says, will Jude be more expensive than Enzo Fernandez? Who cares, Agam? Who cares? He's not coming to Liverpool now. Who cares? Basically, Ash suggests Thuram and Kone. Give us something positive, Ben. So we know French media, L'Equipe, are suggesting that Liverpool have began talks with Khéphren Thuram, son of the great, magnificent Lilian Thuram, the brother of the not so brilliant Marcus Thuram, who plays as a forward. Maybe I'm being harsh, but hey. But Khéphren Thuram definitely fits the profile, the age, that has the attributes that I and most Liverpool fans would think Liverpool require. Khéphren Thuram, Nice, the price range is muted to be around the 50 million figure, which again is the ballpark figure that FSG usually likes to do business at. Have you heard anything yourself on this, and what do you make of this rumor?
Yeah, I think there's something in this for sure, and it will be interesting to see whether or not, if Liverpool or any other suitor proceed, they can actually shave a bit off that price, because I'm told that Nice really need to sell. So the touted valuation...
Interesting side note, Ben, I'm so sorry. Interesting side note, because you've just reminded me. Nice owner, Jim Ratcliffe, possibly attempting to try Man United. Would there be any complications as such in terms of trying to do it like this? Or would you suggest that, there are eager, or not eager sellers, but willing sellers?
I think willing sellers, and to be honest with you, if Ratcliffe buys Manchester United, regardless of what will be said now, because you have to say all the right things, it wouldn't remotely surprise me to see him take a step back from Nice. It's very important to stress when I say that there is Ineos, which is actually the vehicle trying to buy Manchester United, and then there's Sir Jim Ratcliffe, who often gets spoken about, and he could very easily allow Ineos and people connected to Ineos to run Nice, whilst himself taking a step back from the day-to-day of that club. And I think when we had also suggestions, and not only suggestions, but a public offer for Chelsea, when Ratcliffe, around about a year ago, when Clearlake Bowley were already in an exclusive period, came out and went rogue in the process and announced that he wanted to buy Chelsea, there was again suggestions that he would step back from Nice. So it'll be interesting to see if he buys Manchester United, how that impacts Nice. Again, not from an Ineos perspective, but specifically in terms of his day-to-day and commitment. And then were Liverpool to move, I doubt anything connected to Manchester United would be significant. And if Ratcliffe is to succeed, things are going to have to move very quickly anyway, because at this point, there's no preferred bidder. Sheikh Jassim and the 9-2 Foundation are also there as well. And a lot of people have said to me, and there's two sides and there's smoke and mirrors around all of this But without going into too much detail, because obviously we're talking Liverpool, not Manchester United, many believe that Ratcliffe might be a kind of stalking horse to drive up the price and eventually get Sheikh Jassim and the 9-2 Foundation to bid higher. But the flip side of that is there are those close to the Ineos team that remain cautiously optimistic. So that's all just going to come down to, do the Glazers want to stay or go? And if they want to stay, they've only got one main offer, which is Jim Ratcliffe. And if they want to go, then they have Sheikh Jassim, who is prepared to buy 100% of the club. And they've got Sir Jim Ratcliffe, who's flexible. So he can present one structure that allows two of the Glazers to stay, but he's also prepared to buy all 69% of their shares as well. And if you get that scenario where all 6 Glazers want to sell, then it's effectively going to come down to the highest bidder. But the Nice thing won't complicate this as far as Liverpool are concerned. And at the moment, it's very early stages from what I gather. So we should give credit and flag the fact that this was a story from L'Équipe, as you referenced in the question, and it's developing. So over the course of the next 2 days, we'll find out how concrete things are. But I was told that the price at the Nice end that they are looking for could be shaved off a little bit. So some are reporting as high as 60 million. Some are saying it's a little bit closer to 55 or under. I think it's going to be more in the region of 50 million if a sale is made, which would certainly contribute a decent bit of business for somebody that is successful. And the other thing to say in all of this is just that the player has attracted quite a bit of other Premier League interest as well. So don't be surprised if there's more than one suitor, because if Nice are in a position where they need to sell and that price has, let's just call it 10 million shaved off it, then there'll be more than one suitor in the mix. So I've been told many times, and this dates back a couple of months, that Aston Villa have been one club that have looked at the player as well. And then if L'Équipe are to be believed, Liverpool are now advancing their interest as well. So it's one to watch. What I would say as well, just finally on this, is that from the perspective of the player, you'd expect a player to say this, but he has said pretty repeatedly that he is happy at Nice. But I think for the right price, they will absolutely entertain a sale.
Absolutely. I tend to agree with you. I also believe that, again, another player like Alexis McAllister, like the previous mentioned Jude Bellingham, and like another player that I'm going to mention straight after this, the father is playing quite an active role in this, I believe, and his father is quite actively it's quite favourable towards his son playing for Jurgen Klopp and Liverpool. We know that he has some very good mates in the squad, especially Bukonate, who are very good pals. I know that doesn't mean anything in sort of the grand scheme of things, but small things like sort of having familiarity with teammates and being friends, similar age group, been playing through the ranks together at the French under-21 international squad as well, and get-togethers, it can play a part. I believe I agree with you. I think it's one to keep an eye on, and I think it's another one that it's looking good. I'd say I was going to say looking likely, but we know what social media is like when you say looking likely, because this goes on to the super chat that I wanted to bring up. We know how social media works, and Zuberi, big up my friend Zuberi, who does the call-in show with me on the weekends. I know I've neglected it for a little while, but that will be back. Ben, has social media affected the integrity of journalists and media outlets in regards to concrete news versus clickbaits for relevancy?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what social media does is it takes things out of context. And I don't mean that in a negative way towards the excellent aggregators that work in that space. And I also think that everyone's restricted by characters. But the transfer window is full of uncertainty and twists and turns and games. And then Twitter wants black and white in particular, but all social media platforms want yes or no. They want, are we going to sign the player? Yes or no. Is it done? Yes or no. What's the fee? And it's never that black and white, because we will always get instances where something looks done and there's a twist. Karim Benzema is a good example. Only today he had a verbal agreement to extend with Real Madrid. A massive Saudi offer has come in, and now he's got a decision to make. Everyone reported that Messi had a verbal agreement with PSG to extend, and he's leaving at the end of the season. So social media hasn't necessarily affected the integrity of journalism, but what it does with transfers is simplify things when they're actually always complicated. And I know that people won't want to hear that, but I say it every single window. If you want to know clear reality, you've got to get off social media, you've got to go to bed, you've got to put a notification on your club channel, and you've got to wait for them to announce every single transfer. If you want to ride the roller coaster with us, then get on social media, but be prepared for ups and downs and twists and turns, because all we can do is report what we believe to be accurate at the time. And the reason why we always qualify it, and the reason why we sometimes sit on the fence, is because our job is to try and be accurate. And to be accurate, you have to outline the different possibilities. And until a deal is done, of course, there might be another suitor. Of course, there might be an instance where somebody hijacks. And of course, there might be a late twist. And that is just how football works. And there's not a transfer I can really think of that ever has just had a singular suitor and a completely clear path. Sometimes there's a likely path, sometimes there's a favourite, but there'll always be somebody else that randomly tries, even if they have a low chance of success. There'll always be someone that puts doubt into the mind of a player. And there'll always be scenarios where something looks likely and maybe an injury happens and the club changes their mind on a player. They might keep them instead of selling them. And Mason Mount's a good example of that. We can kill two birds with one stone and just touch upon him during this answer as well. There is a feeling from the suitors that he's available in the market and won't sign a new deal with Chelsea. But from Chelsea's point of view, they've always said that they'll pick things up at the end of the season and they'll make a push. And now Mauricio Pochettino's come in. It might be too late for him to influence the situation, but Chelsea have always said they're going to try. And the only thing that will stop them doing that is Mason Mount saying, you've got no chance, I want to go elsewhere. So this is a fluid situation. And if you'd have asked me 6 months ago or a year ago, I'd have said that it was nailed on that Mount would sign a new deal. But suddenly Mason Mount is in a position where if he signs a new deal, he might not get the amount he wants, but also he may have to sign a deal that includes a lot of different incentives that are slightly different in terms of structure than he would have been able to get if he'd have been negotiating last summer and when the ownership group first came in, when he may have had a bit more power and also things like Champions League decreases were not in play. So there's been a lot of back and forth earlier in the year between Mount and Chelsea, a lot of kind of verbal promises or seeming agreement that never materialized, and some big gaps in valuation as well, as far as some of the finances have been concerned. So that gives a window of opportunity. And Manchester United are pushing. Eric Ten Hag really wants Mason Mount. Liverpool and Arsenal have inquired as well. So they're well aware of the situation. And then, of course, there's the number. And Chelsea are going to have to sell if Mount doesn't extend, because they don't want the contract just to run down. But all of the suitors value Mount a little bit lower than Chelsea's valuation, which is 70, could even be 75. And I think the suitors feel like, because of the contract situation, 55 or 60 is something a little bit more reasonable. So we'll wait and see with Liverpool, because the feeling is that Mount may well be leaning towards Manchester United, and they've got Champions League football, but Manchester United have got to be able to move for Mount as well. And it's all very well saying Manchester United want 6 or 7 players, but they don't even know who their new owner is or whose money they're spending. So that might be a factor as well, and they might have to prioritize one name over the other. But the reason why I use that as an example is just because social media will just take one thing I've said from that. And when I log off this live video, it will say, Ben Jacobs says that Mason Mount hasn't signed a new contract at Chelsea and won't sign a new contract at Chelsea because he's going to tell them that he's leaving the club, and Manchester United are pushing. And what I've actually said is that Chelsea haven't yet shown their hand, and that Manchester United want Mount, but there's a valuation gap. And the context is so important. And I understand the frustration of a fan in saying, but from all of that, I don't know where Mason Mount is going to play next season. But guess what? at the time we're recording, Mason Mount doesn't know what club he's going to be playing at next season. So if I am to tell you something
Selective
that even
hearing.
Mason Mount doesn't know, then I'm being irresponsible as a journalist because I'm second guessing the situation. And this is just the window. A lot of deals happen late. Enzo Fernandez was 4 minutes before the window shut in January.
Absolutely.
So all we can really do is try and give you the context. And then just lastly, when you were asking about the names and why there's so many of them, it's just because in a window, you don't go, I want 1, 2, 3. Let's go and get 1, 2, 3. You go, I want position A, position B, and position C. Then you go, what are the options? Then you go, who's feasible? Then you go, who's feasible and who's at value? Then you go, who am I competing against? Then you enter a series of races and you might have dual targets and you're happy with either of them and ultimately lose out in one race and pivot, or lose out because the value isn't right and pivot, as Liverpool did with Bellingham. Or the last thing that you may do is actually leverage one target against another, which is more the gamesmanship element of the window. And by that, I mean, why wouldn't you go to two like-minded players that you might be interested in or you might not, and explore both possibilities, because each gives you a valuation yardstick, and one might have a release clause or one might have a club that's prepared to quote a price. And in doing so, you can then go to your other negotiation and say, you know, and I know that these are like for like players. They're like for like profiles. They're like for like ages. And you're saying that this player is 70 million. I can go and get this player for 50 million because we've explored the terms and the conditions. So you've either got to reduce your price, or we're going to go and get the 50 million pound player instead of the 70 million pound player. And then you might end up being left with a player and you might need a fee. And that's exactly what happened, for example, with Milan Skriniar last summer, where PSG came along, they offered about 60 million euros, and Inter said, no chance, we're not selling, we want more, we want 70 to 75 million euros. And PSG said, we're going to be patient then and we'll get him on a free transfer. And that's exactly what's happened. And now, because Inter haven't got that money and they've still lost the player a year on, they're probably going to have to sell somebody like Onana and maybe even one more, because their finances aren't great. And because in an ideal world, if they do move and try and keep Romelu Lukaku, they're going to have to put some money behind that. And then the last thing is, of course, the names come from agents, the names come from PR, the names are put out there by a variety of different sources, which no journalist will ever reveal. But it is fair to say that you've got a club side, you've got a player side, you've got an agent side, and you've got a gamesmanship side. And the more names that are out there, the more PR there is for a player, or the more a club can use it as a smoke screen and then move under the radar for their actual target, or the more they can ward off another club because they've put genuine interest out there. There's all kinds of possibilities, but social media doesn't care about any of that. And people that like to engage in social media will just say, all I've done in explaining that is kind of ramble. But the reality is that transfer windows are not simple. They're wild, they're uncertain. And if you're going to follow it day on day, the best guide for following it is context. And if you don't like the context because you don't think it comes with enough clarity, then go to bed, put on your club notifications, and every time your phone then beeps, it will only be because there's a certain done deal. And if you're pulling your hair out over everything in between before you get to that done deal, then relax, go on holiday, and come off social media.
I want to end the show. I'm not going to lie. The reason why I want to end it, because you've actually nailed it. I mean, this is what I've been sort of promoting on my channel as well, and the kind of things I want to say as well. In fact, as you were speaking, No Beats Football Analysis, listen carefully, people. It's all about context. Football Khanage always gives you context and the full picture, and not just the clickbait stuff. Great show. Appreciate the love and appreciate the support, of course, every time. You're so spot on. But I can't add, and I'm definitely not going to subtract anything from what you said. Just going to go through the last couple of questions before we round off, because Ben is a very, very, very busy man. Sean says, is there any links to Guerrero from Dortmund on a free? I probably can answer that. I don't think it's the profile or priority position for Liverpool at this stage. I think if we do go for a defender, it will more likely to be a defender that can also play as a centre-back or as an auxiliary left-back, more in the mold of a Jurriën Timber, who I know we have begun talks with Ajax So that is one to look out for in terms of profile and stylistic. If we bring in a defender, like I think we will. There was one more name, Mason Mount. So what's your hunch then, very quickly, about Mason Mount, where he ends up? So we've established that is most likely to leave Chelsea, and Man United are pushing for him. Liverpool, we know, have done a lot of the legwork behind the scenes. Again, his father was involved in the talks. I know he was at Anfield in January for talks. But what's your hunch, very quickly, on that?
Yeah, just before we come into that with Guerrero, nothing to add on that one. Certainly a possibility that if it develops, I'll update you, but nothing that I've really inquired about at this point to be able to shed too much on it, other than the history, which is, I suppose, something we can add, which is that Liverpool have considered that player in the past. I think back in the 2019-2020 season, off the top of my head. And at that stage, he was perhaps a little bit concerned about the game time that he would get, and playing, no doubt, second fiddle to Andy Robertson. So that's perhaps the only thing to add to that there's a historical interest on Liverpool's side, but I can't say too much more on that one. Haven't made any inquiries on that particular one. With Mount, my feeling remains the same, that Chelsea will try and Pochettino will attempt to influence the situation. So it's for Mount to decide, and he hasn't yet. But if he goes, and there is a high probability that that is going to be the case, then Manchester United are the ones that are the most confident at this stage on the player side. But there's two parts to every transfer. There's the player side and there's the fee. So my one thing about Manchester United this window is just that because of financial fair play, regardless of any new owner that comes in, their budget's not going to be sky high, but qualifying for Champions League helps. So if they moved early for Mount at 55, 60 million, then how do they then sign a 70 to 100 million traditional number 9 striker, which is the priority? And they may well need a centre-back. And a lot of people think that they're getting quite advanced on Kim from Napoli. And he's got a release clause, by the way, that's only valid in the first 2 weeks of the window. So I doubt they'll trigger that clause because they won't want to pay it in one lump sum. But if they match that clause, that is something in the region of 40 million. So you're in a position all of a sudden where they're going to sign a flagship striker and they're going to have to withhold those funds because it's likely not to be something they can get on day one of the window. Then if Mount's 60 million and Kim is 40 million and there's a few other players that they're definitely looking at in a very serious sense, they're going to have to prioritize, and they're going to have to explore outgoings, and they're going to have to hope that the ownership situation is resolved, because otherwise whose money are they spending? So there's a whole variety of things at play. And I only point that out because if Mount is genuinely who they want as number one first through the door, then I think Manchester United can get that deal done, providing Chelsea don't influence the situation, which is still Chelsea's intent. But if Manchester United decide that Mount's one of their top three, but they want to go for someone else first, there still might be a window of opportunity for another club. I wouldn't get overexcited at this stage about Liverpool and Mount, but it's absolutely true that they are across the situation and they're monitoring what goes on at Chelsea, and then it will all come down to price. Liverpool won't overpay for Mount, but the beauty of Mount is that every single person I speak to in the game, at Chelsea, at Liverpool, at Arsenal, at Manchester United, says the same thing, that they believe that with the right coach, the right environment, he'll get back very, very quickly to 2 seasons ago now, where he scored 11 Premier League goals, and a settled Mount is absolutely a 70, 80, even 90 million pound player. That's what he can grow into. But you don't necessarily want to pay that type of fee when you look at the fact that the contract is winding down. And this is why I think that anyone that proceeds with Mount will try and push for a slightly lower number. So there is a valuation gap between what Chelsea would quote if they're resigned to selling Mount and what the suitors are willing to pay. So we can't entirely discount Liverpool, but I do think at the moment, Mount is leaning towards Manchester United if he is to depart Stamford Bridge.
Dinesh sends in a suggestion, where is Bobby going? I don't think it's been sort of much talk about where he's going, but wherever he goes, they'll be getting, for me, an absolute brilliant player and a better human being. Have you heard anything on the grapevine with regards to Bobby, Ben?
I mean, Bobby Firmino, first of all, fantastic Liverpool player. Brilliant to see him score on his final game and his final match at Anfield as well. So that was sort of written in the stars. Bit of a shame from Liverpool's point of view. It ended up a 4-4 draw, but end of season madness. And obviously Firmino was off the field anyway, so was never going to be able to score that 5th goal. But Salah did have a range of chances, didn't he? Immaterial though. But with Firmino, I think that Liverpool obviously wanted to keep the player. Firmino decided that he wants a fresh challenge. There's a few options on the table. The latest of them is Real Madrid, who do have some serious interest in the player. We'll wait and see whether that advances. It'll also be intriguing as to whether Benzema stays or goes, because there's this huge offer from Saudi Arabia on the table. Saudi Arabia have also got Bobby Firmino on their list, and there's a low confidence that he will take that offer, but it's not impossible. And the more players that go to Saudi Arabia, I suppose the more appealing it will be to other players, because you want to feel settled, you want to be familiar with other names there. I suppose in some ways there's less, in inverted commas, risk about going to Saudi Arabia if 7, 8, 9, 10 players go. And by risk, I don't mean anything against Saudi Arabia. I just mean in terms of the quality and development of the league, because we saw this in China before there was a quota that forced more homegrown players, where a ton of players went over and it felt like a great payday, and it just didn't really work out for a range of players because the standard wasn't high enough and some didn't take in terms of settling to the culture over there. And I was speaking to a player that I know quite well, Martin Boyle, who is at Hibernian, and he went over briefly to Saudi Arabia and had a fantastic time, but it's a culture shock as well in many ways. Training times are different. Language is obviously different for many players, not every player, but certainly in the case of Firmino. So again, you want to make sure, who do I know? Who's the coach? Does anyone else speak the same language as me? Where am I going to live? It's not just about what you're going to get paid. And the last thing is that it's a Saudi offer. So everyone often affiliates a club like Messi Al Hilal, and that may well be the case, but this is Saudi Arabian government and the Saudi Pro League coming together to strategically buy and place players throughout their league to make it stronger. So the player has a say, of course, but ideally they want to spread a list of about 20 names, and it will become about 50 to 100 names in the next 3 years across their league to generate a series of clubs that are competitive. And it's weird because you got, for example, Gary Cook, the ex-Manchester City executive who's part of the Saudi Pro League. And imagine if that was the Premier League saying, we've got the opportunity for Firmino, and where should we send him? Should we send him to Man United? Should we send him to Liverpool? Should we send him to Manchester City? It would be ridiculous to have the league inputting onto who the signings were and where they were going to be placed. But that's kind of what's happening in Saudi Arabia. And Firmino is one of those possibilities. There has been some interest from Turkey as well. And I think one to watch, but it will depend on their new manager, because we now know that Luciano Spalletti is going to leave as Napoli as well, who really love Bobby Firmino. They've not advanced anything at this point, so I wouldn't want to get Napoli fans overexcited. But I know that the Napoli president has a great admiration for Firmino. And if Napoli have a series of outgoings and many of their players are highly sought after and a new manager comes in, we'll have to wait and see whether they enter into the mix in any capacity. So it's undecided at the moment. And by the way, the reason why that is undecided is because Firmino's been through this whole process with maximum respect for Liverpool. So he was not prepared to concurrently talk to other clubs whilst working out what he was going to do at Liverpool. He wanted to decide on his future, then inform Klopp, and then handle his future either towards or now at the end of the season. And that's a mark of respect to Liverpool, even if it gives him a bit of uncertainty over the course of the next few weeks. Something may happen quickly, but regardless, Firmino was never the type of character to say to Liverpool, I'm not going to give you an answer until I've lined something up. And that was solely out of a respect to Klopp and Liverpool Football Club.
Absolute class, epitomizes the man on and off the pitch, as you said. So let's hope his future is cleared up and he gets the move that him and his family deserve. Gary sends in a message, and I'll probably take this one to end with Timber and Gravenberch, because I do happen to have a bit of intel on this. Timber, as I said, I did tweet about a week or so ago that we have initiated a discussion with Ajax and with Bayern about Gravenberch. If people missed out on last night's show, I had We Talk Ajax, a couple of people from We Talk Ajax who spoke glowingly about Gravenberch and gave us all the insight into the player, the man, his profile, his attributes, his strengths and weaknesses. So make sure you check out last night's episode if you haven't. Gravenberch, from my understanding, is, again, Bayern Munich at the moment are reluctant sellers again, but they're going through a whole heap of sort of change themselves by obviously sacking Oliver Kahn and Salihamidzic. So there's a bit of uncertainty at Bayern. Tuchel apparently is a fan of Gravenberch, but you've got to remember they have Goretzka and Kimmich already stapled starters, you could say. I know Gravenberch started the last game. They've also got Lima coming in from Leipzig, and they're also making various inquiries on other central midfielders, which suggests maybe they're biding their time on Gravenberch and assessing the market. I believe Gravenberch wants to come to Liverpool. Again, his father has spoken to Jurgen Klopp. I believe there is a deal to be made if we pursue it, but I think it's one of those deals that may go to the nearer to the end of the window, and because I think Bayern would want to get their players or player in midfield before they decide on Gravenberch. I don't know if you want to add or subtract anything on that.
Nothing really to add. I mean, I've reported many times that Gravenberch wasn't happy under Julian Nagelsmann, who also sort of questioned a bit of his defensive discipline. And it'd be interesting to see whether Liverpool agree with that, because Liverpool place great emphasis on very simple things to begin with: a player's first touch and how they respond to losing the ball. And Nagelsmann was not happy with what Gravenberch did off the field or either off the ball. And by off the field, I don't mean any personal problems. I just mean the application in training with some of the basics, and also then in games, that ability to read the situation and input defensively. And I think Nagelsmann got very frustrated with that. And similarly, Gravenberch felt like he was being boxed out, that he wasn't being given enough game times. There's two sides to every story here. And I'm by no means saying that Gravenberch is a bad egg or lacks work ethic. Quite the opposite. A lot of people I speak to are full of praise for him and very sympathetic to his situation at Bayern Munich. So there's two sides to every story. But Bayern's position, certainly with Thomas Tuchel, was originally, when he arrived, that Gravenberch would stay. And one of the first things that Thomas Tuchel did was hold quite a big one-on-one with Gravenberch to try and remotivate him. But there's so much change at Bayern, let's wait and see, because Liverpool tried before he moved to Bayern and explored the possibility of signing the player. So this is one to watch over the window. As I say, Bayern's position has always been consistent, that they ideally don't want to sell. But the player's position is that if an offer comes, he wants to consider it because he's not enjoyed his time at Bayern. So we can't categorically say the player is for sale, because that's not what Bayern sources are intimating. But what we can say is that it's a long window. And if Liverpool were to move, then they would likely have the support of the player.
There you have it, guys. I've been inundated on my phone now with, suddenly I'm about to end the show, but a few personal mates are asking, if you've got Ben, you have to ask him. You have to continue asking him. I can't. Ben has done a huge favor for me for coming on in the first place. He's a busy man. We must move on. But people are suggesting that Fabrizio Romano is just reporting. In fact, Fabrizio Romano hasn't reported. Altobelli, Germany's reporter. Is it Sky? Does he work for Sky? Ben, would you know Altobelli? I'm not sure. But I think he's reporting interest in Manu Kone now. Another profile of player that absolutely fits in. I had heard we are interested in January for this said player, but apparently it's concrete now as well. Another player in the price range that we've been discussing, predominantly our players or the price or range that we go for is around the 50 million ballpark figure. Again, someone who's very highly thought of. Manu Kone, Borussia Mönchengladbach. You can tell I've been practicing that name. I've nailed that one, Ben. Surprise, surprise. But anything on Manu Kone from your side?
Not a great deal to add other than has always been there as a Liverpool target. And I think that the price would be good value from Liverpool's point of view. Playing, as you say, at Borussia Mönchengladbach. And usually what happens in this kind of situation when a player is on the list, as far as a midfield target is concerned, is you would go to the player side first in order to express an interest and see what's possible. And I did a little bit of research into Manu Kone when there were Manchester United links. So this was more like a couple of months ago. And the number I was told at that time that may produce a sale, this is on the club end, would be somewhere in the region of £35 million. So let's wait and see whether that's the kind of ballpark. But I don't think we'd be looking at a 50 million or something quite that high. I think that there's a deal to be done there potentially for 15 or 20 million less.
There you go, people. As you can tell, me and Ben could probably talk for hours and hours upon.
I actually can't talk for hours because
exactly.
My battery is at 1%. So
1%. Ben's
disappear. Then
exactly.
Why.
Exactly, guys. We have only time to thank Ben and thank you, the chat. It's been brilliant chat. It's been amazing insight. We will request and beg Ben to come on again at some point in the transfer window for some great wisdom. Thank you very much, Ben. Of course, first and foremost.
Yeah, all the best. Keep up the good work. I know that you're off for a family wedding, so enjoy that. But I always enjoy listening to your shows, and I hope that everyone has a good summer and enjoys the transfer window.
There you go, guys. This has been Transfer Khanage. You have been amazing. We will see you all very soon. Take care. Peace.